Jolly good. Well, thank you very much for a remarkable film. And
Thank you.
I think everyone, by the warmth of that applause, everyone appreciated it. So I think what would be helpful, just at the beginning, why don't you tell us what roles you had in it, first of all? How did that work?
I'm a director on the project.
So you were doing a lot of the filming?
Yes, I was in Pakistan. Himal, who is also a director on this project and the producer, she started shooting, and she came to Pakistan in 2009 for a few weeks, and then began the origination of the concept of the project. And then, unfortunately, after that, she wasn't able to come back. And so I took over most of the shooting since then for the next several years.
And she was unable to do that because?
Well, when she originated the project, and I mean, I can speak for Himal just because we've done this Q&A several times. She herself is an Indian from Mumbai, and she lost a really close friend of hers during the Mumbai terror attacks in 2008.
Right.
And she was very, very angry, especially towards Pakistan, because it was alleged that the perpetrators of the Mumbai terror attacks were Pakistanis. And at a certain point, she realized that she had such hatred towards a country that she really knew nothing about. So she decided to start reaching out to different members in the Pakistani community, went to different mosques in America. At that time, she was living in New Jersey. And then she basically made her way to Pakistan, and she found that she wanted to make a film on the ideological divide amongst Muslims themselves, and specifically in the field of education. She found that Muslims and Pakistanis themselves were some of the biggest victims of these terror attacks. And so when she got to Pakistan, she started following Zarina, who was the girl in the story, and she also followed Tala, who was the boy in the story, and of course some of our other characters. And what became obvious to her in her production was that she needed to actually get access into the Red Mosque itself, because you needed to finally actually speak to the main perpetrators of this ideological dialogue. And it also became obvious to her that she needed to collaborate with a Pakistani and a Muslim. And so I came on board in 2010. And so, yeah.
And you got that remarkable access?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't something that happened overnight, and I should say that the rest of our Pakistani team as well, aside from Jonathan, who is the producer writer on this film, the rest of our entire team was Pakistani, from our DPs to our co-producers, Syed Musharraf Shah and Azia Syed Ali.
So Jonathan, why don't you tell us what, when you got involved and what your role was?
Sure, as Mo just said, I'm the producer and writer on the film, one of two producers along with Himal. When Himal and I started talking about the film in 2009, basically, I was primarily a director, but I felt that this would be an important film to get involved with, to help somebody else get a film made. So started working with her as a producer shortly thereafter. As Mo alluded to, we basically were making a film about what became about the two children before we even considered filming with Aziz or making it about the Red Mosque or really even thinking that much about the Red Mosque itself as a character. I mean, that really came later, and a lot of what you see in the film is down to the access that Mo and our Pakistani team developed over many years, really, because we'd made this film for 6 years it took before we finished it. I think a year later we were really happy, thrilled, extremely lucky. It's been borne out in what you see on the screen to find Mo, and that relationship among the three of us really developed.
So did you have much experience with Pakistan before getting involved in this?
I don't have much experience in Pakistan now, I would say. I mean, I think we get asked this question a lot at Q&As, and I don't think it would have been safe for me. I think I would have put our crew at risk if I had been in probably any of the filming situations, perhaps other than with Pervez Hoodboy, who I did film with on a couple of shoots, because he's actually, he comes to the States to lecture sometimes too. So, I had the pleasure of meeting him in 2010. But,
so before I throw this open to the audience to ask questions, you came to this fairly fresh then, in terms of Pakistan. So what in this whole process surprised you most?
So many things, really. I mean, I think you learn something new every day if you're dealing with a culture that's very different from my own as an American or, most Western cultures. I wasn't coming to it as someone who had studied the region either. So, I was coming to it as a storyteller. I was coming to it as someone who actually on 9/11 I was here in London in Shepherd's Bush editing a film, and every day I would have lunch with people in shops, many of whom were immigrants, and would talk about subjects that most Americans probably aren't exposed to. I think the issue of valid grievance became something in terms of just something in my thinking about the region and America's complicity in that when I would then go back to the States, it would really be absent from the dialogue. And when Hamel approached me to consider working on this project, it really seemed like an opportunity to show the West in some ways, from my perspective. I mean, I think it's an opportunity to show the whole world, but from my perspective, it's an opportunity to show the West that it's really an indigenous story that's happening in terms of terrorism, and that we in the West are largely a sideshow, really. We're not the main front of the battle that's going on for the future of the Muslim world or the future in this sense.
And Mo, you obviously had a lot more familiarity with a lot of these issues before you started getting in this deep, but what surprised you?
What surprised me actually was how little people outside of Pakistan knew that we ourselves are some of the biggest victims of terror. In fact, when Himmel first approached me to do this project, I was a little wary. I'm a documentarian. I've done several other documentaries, and they're all based in Pakistan. I myself am from Karachi, although I split my time between New York and Karachi. And I was a little wary because, of course, as you know, India and Pakistan have their own special relations. And here was an Indian Hindu wanting me to do a film on the Red Mosque. So I was like, okay. But, of course, my own propensity to engage in this project increased manifold, because this is a story that's so dear to my heart and to several other Pakistanis. I mean, we have this lunatic fringe in Pakistan that's really overtaking so many different segments of our society. And it's such a shame that you don't actually get to hear their stories and their voices. And it was really, I mean, as a Pakistani myself who was actually in New York, who witnessed 9/11 firsthand, I really did see that shift in the way I, as a young male Muslim, was approached, how the rest of my community and people looked at us, how that was approached. And since then, the narrative has always been West versus Islam. And it's very rudimentary, crude way, and it's so intellectually dishonest, and it's such a problematic perspective to have, because really, if you really want to make changes and have this ideological change happen, that can really just happen indigenously, and hence that's why we call the film Among the Believers, and that's why this film was so important for me to do and to join up, and it was a privilege for me to actually then join up with the rest of this team and manage to develop this story much further and lend it the authenticity that it needed, really, to have a Pakistani voice.
Yeah, well, I mean, authentic is exactly a very, very good word to describe it. So let me open this up. We've got a roving mic, I think we do. So, any questions from any of you who've seen it? Yeah.
Thanks. Hi. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. I thought it was an extraordinary way of telling that story.
Thank
Both
you.
of my parents here grew up in Karachi, so I think they both really enjoyed it as well. I know you talked about it a bit, but could you elaborate on what the process was for gaining access to the Red Mosque and kind of how you developed that relationship with Aziz?
Sure. A very simple cursory answer would be, our production was so long. It was 5 years. Actually, the total of it was 6 years, but to get access to the Red Mosque and to shoot with Aziz, we shot with him on and off for 5 years. And you can say that, of course, the more longer period you spend with someone, the more you're able to develop a trust with them. I mean, that's kind of been the case with my other projects and documentaries too. They have long production periods. But I'll just tell you a little bit of my own backstory. I grew up in Karachi. I belong to a minority Muslim sect. I'm a Shia Muslim. And you have to understand, growing up in Pakistan and Karachi in the 90s, we were plagued by a lot of sectarian violence. So meeting someone like Maulana Aziz, someone who actually had allegiances to some of these sectarian violent groups and targeted specific people and members in my community. I mean, I'd lost, extended family members. 2 of them died in sectarian killings in Karachi in the 90s. So I definitely came with my own baggage and definitely came with my own perspective when I was meeting this man. And I could be a journalist and an objective documentarian, and I tried my best to disengage with that. And I have to say, the first interview we ever got with Maulana Aziz was in 2010, when a co-producer of ours, Sayyid Musharraf Shah, who's also Pakistan-based, was able to snag us an interview. And if you remember, this was right after Maulana Aziz had been released from jail, post-2009. So he was giving interviews to several media channels, to Al Jazeera, even BBC did a special on him and stuff. This level of access, no. I mean, we're kind of privileged and lucky to have gotten this level of access. So we did get our interview. And for the next few years, 2-3 years I would say, we continued to shoot with him, but in touch and go circumstances. We'd shoot with him, and then we'd get calls from like, who are you? You better stop filming, and threats. And once I remember we were driving around Islamabad and this car was following us, and they stopped at a traffic light, jumped out, and they took pictures of all of our faces and then just disappeared. And then, so we'd shoot, we wouldn't shoot with him then again for several months, and then we'd come back and come back. The big shift that happened was within me, I think, in 2013. And the big shift that happened within me was I had to disassociate myself from my own story that I brought when I was meeting this man. And I had to be a blank canvas for him to project on. And I had to meet him in a common ground. And for me, that common ground was questions about my own faith and spirituality. And as a Maulvi Sahib himself, that was some days I was able to engage with him. And from there, we were able to cover the much larger, diverse ground that you see in the film.
And when you say people were trying to stop you doing it and taking a picture and so on, that's from the state, you would think?
I would gather it be from the state and non-state actors.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, one, come to the back there.
Hi, thank you very much for a superb documentary. I really enjoyed that. I'd like to know, would it be released within Pakistan?
Yep, inshallah, that's what I'm trying to do. I leave for Pakistan tomorrow, and we hope to show it in Islamabad with His Holiness present, the Q&A, in April. So that's what we're going to work and hope towards.
With the Maulana present?
Yes,
And where
for the
would you-
Q&A
Where are you trying to do that?
in Islamabad.
Okay. In a TV setup or?
No, during a festival setup.
Okay. Yeah. And this,
So you were saying that you sort of developed this relationship with him,
Mhm.
and I know some of your other projects, and and the fact that you've been working on this very long-term project with arguably his worst enemy. How did that work? I won't say more, you can share it if it's public knowledge. But
Sure. The other project that I'm working on is a documentary on General Pervez Musharraf. I've also followed him for the last 5-6 years while he was in exile here in London and in Dubai, and then his subsequent return and house arrest in Pakistan, and his attempt at returning to politics. I mean, that's other film. I mean, I work on several projects at the same time. Yes, it is kind of funny that these two kind of happened at the same time. But yeah, I mean, you have to work on several projects at the same time to make this as a career sustainable. So, yeah.
I just one down here. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful film. We had the privilege of living in Islamabad for a few years, and so it was nice to see some familiar places. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe, it was mentioned in the film briefly, but maybe the Saudi influence on the Red Mosque, and then maybe the non-Saudi funded madrassahs, and what the difference is, and how they coexist in society a little bit.
Sure. So from an official count, there are about 30,000 madrassahs in Pakistan, officially. Unofficially, that number has been expanded to even 100,000. And so I guess it's anyone's guess as to what the actual number is.
And does that include all madrassas?
All
of
madrassas.
all types? Because I
All
think
types of madrassas.
it's important, I feel, in the West, especially, or anywhere outside of the region, really to point out that, by madrasa, it's just a religious school, or maybe just a school, depending on who's doing the translating. So I just...
It's a religious school, and that doesn't necessarily mean they all have the same curriculum. Of course, there is going to be Hifz, which is the Quranic curriculum, but they might have a more holistic curriculum to include like studying maths and languages and history and whatnot. In terms of Saudi funding, there has been no official proof that is the case. However, in Pakistan, and even Maulana Saab, that was one of the things that we were really trying to get him to own up to. He never did. But it's kind of like an open secret in many ways in Pakistan, and actually in other countries too, that a lot of the funding for these specific kinds of madrasas does come from foreign money and Saudi money. But aside from that, it's not just that. There's with the Red Mosque specifically, a lot of the funding also comes from different private donors within the city of Islamabad or around Pakistan, even expats actually, who are sympathetic towards Maulana Aziz's vision for the country or for what he believes in and want to contribute and support him. As far as all madrasas coming from funding from one source, that's not necessarily the case. I think, as Jonathan even alluded to, within the Darul Uloom, which is one of the main bodies that watches over a lot of the madrasas throughout Pakistan, there are different fiqhs or schools of Islamic jurisprudence that have their own specific madrasas and seminaries, essentially, that run throughout the country, and it wouldn't be fair to paint them all with one wide brushstroke and say that they're all perpetuating militancy. That's not necessarily true. Our story, of course, was more focused specifically on the Red Mosque. So,
I would just, can I add to that?
sure.
I would add to that like during our editing process, obviously Mo and Hemel and I had a lot of intense discussions about what context to add, what context not to add. For a long time, I felt that we needed to really add a text card at some point, perhaps near the end of the scene where Cleric Aziz pockets all of that money that usually gets quite a laugh in many screenings that we have. But, I actually think the film is better without, because there is so much conflicting information out there that, we really want, by screening the film, we're not journalists, first at least, we're filmmakers, and we want you to be motivated to investigate these questions for yourself after you see the film. So, just especially since it's being filmed, I want to encourage people to do that. So thank you for your question.
Hello. I enjoyed the film. Your film gives a very eloquent voice to the sort of systemic nature of the problem. And in the final scenes, with the optimistic soundtrack, we get some idea that you're pointing us in the direction of a possible solution, but the film doesn't really prescribe one. And I suppose that is my question to you, is what do you see as the solution? Because the film very precisely underpins, the whole problem is underpinned by poverty. That the state is not providing a network of state schools. The rural poverty and the urban poverty necessitates parents to send their children to madrassahs. So without that societal-wide difficulty, how is there going to be a resolution of this?
Well, I think it's a multifaceted approach, of course. The solution that we offer in the film, or we hope that many readers pick up on, is by empowering subjects like Tariq, who was the village chief, who himself was uneducated and provided his own land to run the school in the village. Those are really the people that you have to engage with. It's so famous now. It's almost a cliche. I'm sure all of you have heard of Books Not Bombs, perpetuated by Greg Mortenson's book, Three Cups of Tea. But that does hold true to a large extent. And the state does have several schools all over Pakistan, but unfortunately, many of them are ghost schools. There's this building and a structure there, but there's no students. There's not a teacher. It's a complete failure and lack of governance. And this is where your vacuum is built, and you have people like Maulana Aziz step in. There has been, since the release of our film, which we premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival last year in April, Maulana Aziz is not under house arrest anymore. And I'd like to be a little optimistic, and I'm sure many of my countrymen would disagree with me, and that's fine. But what was new in Pakistan after the horrendous attack of the Peshawar school in December of 2014 was that there were civil society groups, even though they were very small and very urban and belonged to, you could say, a particular elite class of Pakistan, but they were actually coming out onto the streets and condemning such acts. That was something that was new and exciting, because before that, people would be too scared to even voice such an opinion for fear safety of their own lives. And even though it's such a small marginal step, it's something. Has that movement continued? In fits and spurts. It needs to be, of course, much larger, and needs to be sustainable. And more so than that, our own government needs to take acknowledgement of it and actually change their tune. They have changed their tune in the sense that they launched the National Action Plan, both the civil and the military factions of our government, and they basically decided to curb militant thinking, reform madrasa, curriculum reform in some of the more militant madrasas. So we have good legislation that was passed since last year. Have they been really pushing it forward? Some would argue that's a little cosmetic, and I would have to agree. It is a little unfortunate that it's not being pushed.
And just to follow up on that, one of the things that occurred to me about what we saw is this remarkable situation that this Maulana Aziz was closely involved in the defiance of the government in the siege of the mosque, and he fled in his burqa, and he spent 2 years in jail. Now this, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are about half a dozen major mosques in Pakistan in which the clerics are state appointed. This is one of them. And so to have the state basically reappoint, or certainly not cancel the appointment of a man who played a role in a situation in which 150 people died is extraordinary, and does suggest that the state is not yet clear where it stands.
Not only that, in fact, during our filming, this is during the previous government, during President Zardari's time, they even gave him exorbitant amounts of land in Sector H to make up for the fact that the state had destroyed his madrassah Jamia Hafsa.
He was compensated.
He was compensated. So there you go. You're absolutely, and now the state is trying him. Even with this current government, the information minister Chaudhry Nisar denied that Maulana Aziz had made some hate speech statements, and when it was found out that actually he had, he's now being tried. So this mixed messaging is what we have currently going on, and I mean, you could look at it as I wouldn't say pessimistic, you can even say realistic, perhaps maybe a little cynical, that, we're not serious, our government is not serious, and maybe they're not. But he is being tried right now. So that's something. For 4 different counts. One was his allegiance to Daesh, one was for hate speech, one was a charge for undermining the state apparatus. The 4th charge I forget. 2 of these charges have been dismissed. 2 of them he's currently out on bail on. This literally just happened a few days ago, and the court testimony came out like 2 days ago. So maybe this dual-sided nature is indicative of an evolutionary change within our own identity and thinking.
It perfectly captures the confusion in the state. Yeah.
I would add to that this scene, this footage that Mo is referring to, where the land grant is provided to Cleric Aziz, was once the potential ending for our film. It would have been a very different film if that had been the ending, where Cleric Aziz is looking out over the expanse of, I don't know exactly how much land it was, saying that we're going to build this madrasa complex here as the ending to our film. I mean, to the last question as well, I think the solutions really need to come from civil society, and the horrific tragedy in Peshawar, actually, one tiny silver lining in that is that we have an example of hope that we can insert at the end of our film to show and hopefully share with others that this movement is rising up, so that hopefully things can change back.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm actually from Islamabad, so this is also very close to my heart. I'm actually just curious if Maulana Aziz knew about your own. I guess
He did.
He did. Okay, and since you mentioned that in 2013 or thereabouts you had a change, I guess, where you decided to have a blank canvas. I wonder if after being with him for so long, you were able to empathize or indeed sympathize with parts of his, where he comes from. Because clearly this person hasn't come out of nowhere. He's come from a certain, I guess, historic and socio-cultural kind of milieu. So I wonder how your views evolved as you spent so much time with him.
Well, I mean, in our own edit process of this, and I mean, I think Himal, who also edited the film, did a great job of trying to maintain that balance, and that was very important for me, definitely. And we had several arguments and fights, in fact, while she was editing the film. It was so easy to make a polemic on Islam with this footage that we had. So easy for me to have that opening scene of this movie be kind of carried out throughout the film, and to perpetuate that narrative and, make some sort of like sensationalistic Fox News piece. Very easy to do that. Of course, I understand where this man and people like him come from. And I think that's what we tried our best to illustrate, that for whatever it's worth, this man is fulfilling a social structure niche that the government is failing to provide. He is actually going and helping out the poor and the needy in his community. He is providing free schooling and shelter and studies for large groups of underprivileged children. So he's certainly doing that. Pakistan has been a pawn in geopolitical strategy for several years. We even showed that with the US involvement and the CIA involvement in bolstering these groups and giving rise to people like Aziz. I'm not blind to that, we even showed that in the movie. But after a certain point, we as Pakistanis have to be like, okay, hang on. When do we take accountability and responsibility? You know, it's very nice and easy to point fingers outside, and some of Imran Khan's messaging is cute and it's fine, but let's grow up. You know, I mean, if we ourselves are not going to take ourselves and stand up for ourselves seriously, how can you expect any other country to do so either?
Seems a very stirring moment to end, but there is one more question, I think, and let's if you've got my just behind. Yeah.
I think you more or less just answered my question, but sorry, Mike.
We'll just take a second.
Quite close, anyway, okay.
So my question was basically just, there's not really a strong narrator sort of presence in the documentary, and you've kind of allowed all of the characters to speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And I was curious as to whether or not that's just your general filmmaking style, or whether there was a particular reason why you adopted that approach for this film. I think you started the previous answer sort of talking about that. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Sure, I think all of us, we collaboratively wanted to present a pretty a myriad of different characters and their own viewpoints in this specific you could say community that they live in Islamabad. And I think that would be most stirring to us, because essentially then the viewers themselves can make their own decisions and their own assumptions from what they learn. I think that, to me, is the most compelling as a filmmaker, and I think Jonathan and Himmel would probably agree, rather than us spoon-feeding you a specific POV. Right?
For sure. I mean, I think, as a filmmaker, I want the people who watch the films to make their own judgments based on fairly presented arguments or fairly presented comments by the people who are in the film, who hopefully will see themselves and actually see themselves in what we've portrayed in the film. And I know that Mo showed Cleric Aziz's footage to him, and Mo might say something more maybe to close about that. But I wanted to go back to your first question before we finished, just to when you asked about what the lesson or surprising thing that I learned was. And it was occurring to me that one of the most surprising things that I learned as an American, not knowing that much or much at all going in about Pakistan, was that this change, tipping toward fundamentalism, as it were, really only happened over the course of a single generation. So I think you as a journalist might put that with a little more nuance, and maybe you can weigh in before Mo has the final word. But I think that, that to me gives me hope that the hotbed of poverty and extremism that we have that's causing some of these issues can actually change in a relatively short span of time, because the rest of the world only knows what we know now because we talk about it more elsewhere since 9/11, and that's an unfortunate fact, because we had a scene in the film with Pervez where he was showing pictures 30 years ago at his university, and it seems like it could be any major city in the world, and that's a lesson and an idea that I think more people need to know about.
Sure.
Did you want to talk about how Cleric Aziz maybe responded to his material, or?
Sure. I mean, one thing we were really, really careful about in the edit, that we wanted to make sure that Aziz could see this film or Dr. Hoodboy could see this film, or Tariq could see this film, basically the other subjects in this film, and they would feel that their voice had been represented fairly. And so I think I really have to give him all her credit on this, because she really did achieve that. And we, I showed Maulana Aziz his scenes in the film, actually, and he was fine with it. In fact, we even recorded him watching his own scenes so he doesn't forget later. But yeah, that was very important for us, right? So that's what makes a really compelling piece, where your subjects within the film feel that they're represented fairly and honestly, and it's not manipulated. And so, and that leaves it essentially for the audience to kind of do their own work.
You've given us a very interesting film, a very interesting discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.